Hello and welcome back to part 2 of our English language guide. So this again is for paper 2 instead of paper 1. If you want to see paper 1, go see the link in the description. And just so you know, in the description of both videos I've put the PDF version of all of this structure, so don't worry about copying it down or anything like that. Just look in the description and you'll be able to find a PDF that has all of this information on it anyway, so we're just going to talk through it. So again, before the exam you want to decide whether you want to do the questions in order or start with question 5, which is sometimes a popular choice. And for the first 15 minutes of your actual exam, read the sources, and what you want to do is annotate. So highlight quotes that you might think will be useful, highlight language techniques that might be useful, but most importantly, in the back of your mind you should think about what's the purpose of this piece of writing. So what are they trying to do? Are they trying to convince you of something? Are they trying to inform you? Think of the audience, so who is it aimed at? So it could be children, it could be mothers, it could be older people, it could be anything. The form, so is it a letter, is it an article, is it a story, and when they were written. So sometimes they actually give you when they were written, just to give a bit of context, but this can be important as it will impact these first 3 things. So for example, in the past few years, something that's come up quite a lot is something like child labour and childhood. And that mainly takes place, so you have one article written nowadays, so 2000s or late 1900s, and you have one written about the 1830s when child labour was a thing, right? Now those will both impact how it's interpreted and what the actual purpose of the piece of work may be. And of course, annotate. You're free to write all over the inserts. For question 1, it's quite simple really. All you need to do is highlight 4 true statements. Now, when you say true, some students do actually get these wrong and do drop marks in this first question. And the reason for that is they're a bit too lenient. Okay, so when the statements are being written, you have to think, does the text literally say this anywhere? That's the first thing you should ask. So go through and find every single quote and see if any of them are literally stated. Okay? And then, once you've gone through those, if you have 1 or 2 left over, you want to go through and say what can be inferred from that. Okay? So what information can you reasonably kind of come up with, okay, that you can deduce from the text, even if it isn't literally stated, okay? Because otherwise you might end up kind of ticking a box that isn't actually correct. And you should spend no more than 5 minutes on this question. Question 2, it's always a comparison between the 2 sources, and you should spend about 8 minutes on this, so it's really not that long. I had a student recently tell me that you're supposed to kind of write 5 to 8 paragraphs. That's way too much, okay? I'm going to show you exactly the structure in 2 seconds. But here's a list of do's and do nots. So do, read the question carefully and underline the key words. Again, if you watched the part 1 video, this sentence should be ingrained in your head. You should summarize the differences between the purpose, audience, and form. So the overall idea of the actual piece of information. And you should find that the actual underlying idea is going to be fairly similar, right? But it might be kind of 2 opposing points of view, if that makes sense. They might both be about child labour or childhood, but then they might have completely different viewpoints on it. Make clear points to answer the question. So again, make sure you read the question carefully and answer the question. So I said this in the last video and I'll say it again in this video for every question. The biggest thing on the examiner's reports, the most common thing, is that students tend to answer questions that aren't even being asked. Okay? What they mean by that is that they'll read the question, then they'll write a response that doesn't seem to answer the actual question itself. So it might be comparing the differences between the author's childhoods, but then they kind of write about child labour and things like that, which is fine to mention it, but you're not going all in for child labour, right? It's about the childhoods themselves. Mentioning it's okay, but going all out on it is not okay. You're not going to get any marks for it. Not many marks anyway. Use quotes as evidence. So again, when you're going through and reading the sources, make sure you're highlighting things that you could use as quotes. And then think about what the quotes suggest and infer. So infer means where you take a piece of information and you draw a conclusion. So for example, if someone comes to my house and I open the front door and they're wet and they have an umbrella in their hand that's wet, I can infer that it's raining without knowing it's raining, right? Because I can make a logical deduction like that. So that's what you need to do with the quotes as well. So don't just take them at what they say at face value. Say, okay, so what does this imply? Does this mean the author thinks it's a good or a bad thing? Is the purpose to convince? Who knows? Do not forget to use words from the question in your response. So this is a really good way on ensuring that you actually answer the question rather than answering your own question that you've made up. And it's not a language question, this first part, okay? It's comparing differences, but it's not comparing differences in language device, so you don't need to analyze the language that they use, okay? And by that I mean literally analyzing the devices, okay? You can use, for example, oh, they used this word, which implies that they think this, which is fine. And also don't mention the reader, okay? This is essentially what the authors are thinking. So here's the structure I'd give. So you want to use 2 paragraphs because you're going to have 2 comparisons. And this, in my opinion, is kind of the shortest way you can write this that will get you the maximum number of marks. So it says use details from both sources to write a summary of the similarities or differences between something. So you'd say in source A, the writer presents this. So good, bad, whatever. Again, use better words than that, but I have to generalize it, right? This is shown in the quotation, which suggests, or this could suggest this, because why? So you need to back up with what you're saying. So if you think it suggests whatever, you need to say, why does it suggest that? Is it the use of certain words? Is it, who knows, right? Then you say, in contrast or similarly, source B presents, and then it would probably be the opposite or the same argument. And this is shown in the quotation, this could suggest. And you want to do this twice, okay? So you're going to have basically 4 paragraphs, right? But it's 2 comparisons. So you're going to have source A says this, does source B agree or disagree? And then again, source A also says this, does source B agree? And that's pretty much it, and you'll get 8 marks for that, okay? But you need to kind of write somewhat quickly, okay? Perfect. Question 3 is a language effect on the reader question, and you should spend about 12 minutes on it. So again, read the question, cool. Only refer to the line stated in the question. Again, this is a mistake that is sometimes made. It's less common than the answer in your own question, thankfully. But what sometimes happens is that it might say lines 15 to 24, and then someone uses a quote that kind of goes on to line 25, or it starts on line 17 or something like that, which essentially they'll just black mark that and they won't mark it at all. So it won't kind of go against you, it just means you're not gaining any marks for anything, which means it's kind of pointless writing it. Make clear points to answer the question, use quotes as evidence, and this time you do want to identify different language devices because it's the language effects. So what you're going to be identifying is say, oh, they used a simile here. What's the effect on the reader? Oh, they used like a persuasive language. Okay, what's the effect on the reader? What's the point of that persuasive language or that simile or metaphor, personification, whatever they've used? What is the point of it? Okay. And then you also want to focus in on interesting words. So vocabulary is actually, quite obviously, it's a really important part of English language, right? The way you use different words will imply different things, right? So if someone's holding something, like if I say I'm holding a tin of beans, right? Just holding it, there's no information there. It just means it's in my hand, right? What if I said I'm clutching a tin of beans? What's the image that gets put into your mind? So for me, it's like I'm holding it close to my chest. Okay, what does that imply? Well, it implies I'm a bit paranoid that someone's going to take this can of beans from me or tin of beans from me. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that means this tin of beans is really precious to me. Why is it precious to me? Well, it must mean that food is in short supply. Why is it in short supply? Has something happened? You know, it's far more interesting, and you can come away with it. Now, of course, you know, maybe nothing has happened, and I'm just paranoid, right? And that's why I'm clutching it. I'm kind of nervous, and my eyes are darting around. Instead of saying I'm looking around, I can say my eyes are darting around, which implies it's very quick, sudden movements, very paranoid. So, different words, just one single word can change the kind of implication of a sentence or of a piece of text entirely. So that's why focusing on interesting words is quite important, and also with your writing, try and use different vocabulary, okay? Try and work out the difference between scared and terrified. Find out what the difference between sad, guilty, and remorseful are. So what's the difference between all of those when we use them? When we use like mourning, for example. Same with remembering. So some people said he remembers when. What about lamenting? So instead of remembering, lamenting is a good word because it's like you're looking back at the past with sadness. So that can kind of make a better word for you. You can also say mourning as well. So do not forget to use word blah blah blah. This is going to be in every single one of them, just like it was in part 1, because it's so important that you just, if you use words from the question, it's far less likely you'll accidentally answer the wrong question. And don't analyse quotes outside the lines mentioned. We've gone through that. And don't mention the writer's feelings, because that's not really important. It's the effects on the reader itself. Okay. Now, to be fair, writers tend to want to make you feel how they feel, right? But in a story, they just might want to make you feel something different, which is completely fine. And here is what I'd recommend. So 12 minutes, and you want to do 2 PEE paragraphs, a point, evidence, explanation. So how does the writer use language to, and it could be anything, right? Which is why I've just put a blank space, which is why there's quite a lot of blanks here. So the writer uses what? Pathetic fallacy, maybe, to describe how the character's feeling, who knows, the sadness of the character, or whatever. This is shown in the quotation, so you would quote where the pathetic fallacy is used. The use of the word, again, you can say clutching or whatever, has connotations of. So that basically means, how does it affect the reader? So again, clutching, it has connotations of like paranoia and fear and suspicion. Because, again, if someone's clutching something, how do they look? This makes the reader feel what? Because what? Now, of course, it could make the reader feel the exact same way as the characters, or whoever's like doing the thing, which, again, makes a lot of sense, but sometimes it can make you feel on edge or uneasy or anxious. And then, again, you say, furthermore, the writer uses blank to describe blank. So you're basically picking out 2 language devices. Okay. And a common question I get asked is, how do I choose which ones? What if I have like 5 language devices? Don't worry about which one's necessarily the most impactful. Which one can you write about? So which one will make the best like connotations? Okay, that's what I would suggest. So does it have like an interesting word in there that you can elaborate on? So these paragraphs aren't meant to just be like 4 lines long each. They're meant to be kind of beefy paragraphs, but so pick the one that you can actually write a decent amount about. That's also a thing for question 5, but I'll go through that in a second. Question 3. Language effects on the reader. So, do read the question carefully and underline big words. Again, you want to spend 20 minutes on this question, by the way. You want to look at the big picture. So summarize the difference between the overall tone, the point, audience, and form. Okay? Identify the clear feelings and emotions of the actual writers themselves. So this time you are talking about the writers. You use quotes as evidence and compare the viewpoints. So overall, I like to think, okay, is it positive or negative? So if it's about childhood, does writer A feel positive or negative about his childhood? Does writer B feel positive or negative? And then I kind of focus in. So once I know it's positive and negative, so A and B is positive, negative, I can focus in and actually make that a bit more interesting. Okay, so you're kind of breaking it down. Use connective, so you want to link together your sentences. One big part of how English can kind of come across really well is if it flows. Okay, instead of having kind of short sentences, like the man stood up, the man walked to the door, he opened the door, he walked out of the door. That is very jarring, right? So it's like start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. It reminds me of like a car that's like breaking down and chugging forward. It's annoying almost. Whereas if you say, the man stood up and made his way over to the door, which he like opened, it makes it flow a bit better. Obviously that's a really basic example, but you don't want to have, let's say in your paragraph you have 4 lines, you don't really want 4 separate sentences. Use because, use furthermore to kind of link them together and makes it flow better. Best way to test the flow is to read it out yourself, right? Do you have to start and stop suddenly? If not, then that's probably a well-written paragraph. Identify language devices, perspectives and structures. We've gone through that. Explain how the language used expresses the feelings and emotions of the writer themselves. And focus in on key words. Again, just like in question 2. And don't forget to use words for the question, blah, blah, blah. And don't mention the reader this time, okay? This is actually about the writers themselves. So the structure here is a bit longer. So again, it's 2 comparisons, so in total it'd be 4 paragraphs. So compare how the writers have conveyed their different ideas and perspectives about, again, childhood could be one. So in source A, the writer feels something about something. Shown in the quotation, use of the word has connotations. This illustrates how the writer feels because. Then you will say in contrast or something, or similarly, but I'm pretty sure it will be contrast in most cases. You write in source B and then you follow the same structure. Then you do the exact same thing again. So the good thing about this structure, and the reason why it was made this way, is that you don't have to memorize the structure. That's not the point of it, okay? So if you have this one paragraph, you can write the next 3 completely fine, right? Instead, if you look, the only difference between paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 is that it has the word in contrast. That's it. And then paragraph 3 and 4 are just copies of paragraph 1 and 2 respectively. Right? It's very simple. But that doesn't mean it's going to be bad, okay? That it's a very useful thing to have. You don't want to spend a long time thinking about how you'll structure something, because it gives you marks, but it's not like an incredibly important bit. The more important part is what you're actually writing itself. Question number 5. Okay, so that was actually question 4. This is question 5. My bad. And you want to spend 45 minutes on this. So the danger is, so going back to the beginning when I said you might want to start with question 5, there is a danger here. Students tend to write a hell of a lot for question 5, which it's not the worst thing, but I recommend trying to limit yourself to 1.5 to 2 pages. Okay, the more is not merrier in this case. So if you start with question 5 and you spend more than 45 minutes, right, you could spend an hour and 15 minutes. How are you going to finish the rest of the paper? Right? Yes, this question is worth the most marks, but it's not worth the most marks if you compare it to the other 4 questions combined. Right? Then it's becoming a lot more even. You don't want to miss out half a paper worth of marks. So again, it depends on how you want to do it. I do see the logic in starting with question 5 in the sense that you can kind of, your arm won't be tired, your hand won't be tired, you know? So ending on question 1, where you're just ticking boxes, it might be an easier exercise for you. But anyways, do read the question carefully and underline key words. Identify and be aware of the audience, purpose and form of your answer. So they'll generally tell you, they might say, write an article to explain to parents. Or they'll say, write a speech for your school. Right? That way, you have the form and you have the audience straight away at your school, where it's going to be students, right? And teachers, I guess. Form, speech, and then purpose. So it could be to illustrate your views on homework, on taxes, on whether the government should be taking care of homeless people. It could be anything, right? And in terms of the whole purpose thing, they do give you a lot of freedom, in the sense they'll say something like, again with the homeless one, for some reason this one's on my mind, it could be something along the lines of the government, not charities, should be the ones taking care of homeless people. Explain how much you agree or disagree in a speech to your school. Some students will say, well, what if I kind of both agree and disagree? Never, ever, ever do both, right? Imagine I was trying to convince you of like whether to buy a PlayStation or Xbox, right? Hypothetically. And I was like, oh, the PlayStation's really good, it has like these good games, but then also Xbox is pretty good too, and like, you know, PlayStation does have HD, and are you convinced when I'm going back and forth and saying they're both good? No. The purpose of this whole question, essentially, is how well you write, but in 9 cases out of 10, it's how well you can convince someone, right? And being able to convince people is a very important skill to have in life, so it is actually a useful part of the GCSE for once. But be very specific, okay? Do not say, oh, it could be this or this. That's not the point of this. Pick one. Which one do I pick? Good question. Which one do you have more arguments for? Right? So let's say you're 4, but you only have 2 points that are kind of right? You say, oh, it just feels like the right thing to do. Well, then pick against if you have more stuff to say about it. Okay? It doesn't matter if it's your actual personal opinion. Okay? It just matters how much you can write about, and also how interesting that writing is. Do you have a really good rhetorical question to start with for against, but not for for? Then do against, and so on. Yeah, so express your opinion explicitly. It should be one-sided, right? In practically every question 5 that I can remember off the top of my head. And write in formal English. So this is quite important. You shouldn't be using slang at all, even if it's to a school, right? So if you're standing in front of the school, now you might think, well, okay, it's informal because I'm talking to my peers. I agree with you there, but always write in formal English because it is an English exam after all, okay? Support your points with evidence and explanation. You're allowed to make up statistics, okay? So again, convince you of Xbox versus PlayStation. You know, PlayStation has 60% more games, or 60% of people like PlayStation more than Xbox or something. I made that up off the top of my head, but you can use it. Why? Because the examiner wants to see, okay, if they had this statistic on hand, then they would have used it, which is a good persuasive technique, right? That's their logic, and that's why they'll mark you up for it, because using statistics is very good to convince people of things. But they're not going to expect you to know a bunch of random statistics, about a bunch of random topics, right? But they're also not going to give you the statistics, because then people will just use them anyway. Use a range of different language devices and sentence structures. So again, make your writing interesting. If your examiner falls asleep while reading your answer, you'll probably get marks very lowly. Very lowly? Very low. And explain to express feelings and emotions. Cool. Again, persuasion, a lot of it is about emotional response. So guilt tripping is actually a very good way to convince people, as you probably know from your parents, right? But for example, if it's taking care of homeless people, it's like, how would you feel if you were on the street struggling to survive? You know, it kind of makes people feel guilty, and then it will help them believe what you're saying. Don't forget to plan. So the plan's quite important, and you can technically be marked for it. You know, it does look favourably upon your answer. Don't make it balanced, right? It's not a discussion, right? You're writing to convince. Don't forget to use words from the question. I know, again, shockingly. Don't forget to clearly paragraph. Remember that you get a bunch of marks for technical accuracy. This involves using different punctuation. So to get the top grades, you need to use semicolons. I would recommend twice or more. But you also need to paragraph. If you write just a block of text, you can't get most of the technical accuracy marks. And don't write too much. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is your writing's more likely to be boring. So let's say I'm writing 2 pages and I have 10 language devices, right? 10 real good language devices. That's 5 a page, which means when the person's reading it, they're, every few lines they're going, oh wow. Now imagine I had 10 language devices but 5 pages. Now there's only 2 per page, right? Or 10 language devices over 10 pages. My writing's progressively getting more boring. And like it or not, the examiners will mark based on how they feel. Do they feel convinced? And believe me, you can't convince someone when they're bored. So writing less can be better. But also, just for the technical accuracy marks, so first of all, you'll lose the actual normal content marks. But secondly, you're more likely to make spelling and grammar errors. Every spelling and grammar mistake that you make will deduct marks from your actual answer. So the more you write, the more likely you are to make a spelling or grammar error. And believe me, there isn't a single human being on the planet that will write 5 pages by hand and not make a single mistake. There's no one on the planet. Why? Because genuinely, even when I'm typing stuff, right? I'll type stuff and then I'll read through it. And even when I've reread it, I might miss the fact that I missed out a comma or I misspelt something. Same with writing. And like it or not, when you reread your work, your brain fills in gaps anyway. So if you have missed a comma, the longer you're writing, the less likely you are to pick up on that. Okay. Anyways, we spent a long time on this, but it is a really big part of the thing. But in summary, write to convince, right? No mercy, right? You want to guilt trip. You want to use statistics. You want to really hammer it home. As if this is the most important thing you've ever said to anyone in your entire life. Okay. And you also want to make it one-sided. It doesn't matter if it's your real opinion. Don't worry about that. That's fine. If you're lucky, then you won't have an opinion either way on the topic, right? Like if it's like, I don't know, nuclear armament or something, maybe you don't care, which means you can just write for either and you really have no qualms about it at all. So, 1.5 or 2 pages is what I recommend. Of course, if you have massive writing, you might have to write a bit more. But here is the kind of breakdown of the paragraphs. I would recommend 5 or 6 sections. And the reason why I say 5 or 6 is because number 2 is optional. But let's go through in order. So 1, you want to introduce your argument. Again, with question 5, do you know how, if you remember what I said, the most common thing is they don't seem to answer the question. With question 5, the most common kind of examiner response is that it's not clear if they're for or against whatever the topic is. So, how do you fix that? Well, how about this? You have a short introduction where you say, I will be arguing against this. Right? Now, it might seem a bit of a cop-out, but it works. Right? Because then, everything you write after that, the examiner's thinking, okay, they're against this. So I'm going to read it in that light. Because it is easy to write something that can be interpreted both ways, which is really bad for the English language exam. So if instead you put the idea in the examiner's head that you're for or against this, then everything you write after that, they'll take it on face value. They'll say, okay, it's probably for or against, right? And I would recommend making the very first sentence an interesting and engaging idea or a device from a forest. I'll go through what a forest is in the beginning, but for example, a rhetorical question, right? They're pretty good. A little bit of guilt tripping, never hurt anyone. And then part 2, this is a very powerful persuasive technique, so I would recommend doing it, but you don't have to, which is why I said 5 or 6. So what you're going to do is you're going to mention the opposing argument and why it's wrong or stupid, yeah, or why your positives are more important than the negatives. Okay, so you can say something like, some people may say this. So one that you could argue is, let's say it was school uniform and you're against school uniform, right? Okay, actually no, you're for school uniform. So you mention the opposing argument. You say, some people may say they're against school uniform because it allows students to kind of embrace their identity. You say, that's a good point. However, think of the disastrous consequences of the students that can't afford nice clothing and then end up getting bullied, right? Now, I've taken that to an extreme, but it's like, okay, I acknowledge the positive, but it's such a weak positive compared to the massive negative, right? And you can do that, which, yeah, it's really influential and persuasive. If you look at any arguments online, well, not online, but if you look at any arguments between professionals, don't go on like a Twitter argument, otherwise you're going to find completely different persuasive techniques, let's put it that way. They will actually say, they'll mention the other person's, let's say politicians, other person's policies, or the other person's ideas, and they'll say why they're wrong or dumb or not correct. It's really powerful, right? Because you're acknowledging their points. You're saying, but that doesn't make any sense. So some of the kind of good arguments that I've seen is, there's one on, this might sound a bit lame, but it's actually on public transport. So this one person said that you can solve traffic, CGP Grey actually said you can solve traffic by having self-driving cars, right? And he explained the whole thing, and it's pretty in-depth. And this person came back and said, well, it wouldn't work because of this. I acknowledge his points. However, isn't it better just to use like trains and like a good public transport? Bit of a derailing, but it was good because he's acknowledging his points. His entire argument against him, he literally goes through his video and responds to every point. So he acknowledges them, he says they're there, but then he kind of destroys them afterwards, at least his idea. Then I would recommend using 3 ideas. So again, overall things. So if it's against school uniform or for school uniform. So for school uniform, it could be it makes everyone more equal. It stops like discrimination in that sense. You don't have to kind of prepare in advance what you're going to wear, and something else. So you want 3 of those ideas, and that's a paragraph each. And again, you want to use a forest. I'll go through a forest is in 2 seconds. And then your closing idea. So you want to link back to the opening with a device. This kind of circular thing is very useful in English literature and language, actually, and is really, really useful. And again, don't balance your point of view, please. So I can't exactly give you a full-on... So this is like the structure, I would say, right? But I can't really give you full-on sentences because, again, they could base on anything. It could be a speech, it could be an article, it could be anything. So here is just some sentence starters that you could use for each of the 5 or 6 sections. So the first section you could say, 3 one-word sentences. So nice short sentences, that could work. Then for part 2, where you're kind of mentioning the other person's point of view, the other side. Some people may say blank, however they are wrong because. Firstly, secondly, finally, or thirdly. So what do you think about blank now? Do you think things need to change? Something like that, okay? Here is the mark scheme for question 5. It's very similar to paper 1, okay? So it's called, the acronym that I use is DROPS. So D, how many language devices have you used, if any, and have you used them well? R, range of punctuation. So this is where semicolons need to be used. I would recommend at least twice. O, is your opening or closing interesting? Now you might notice this is subjective, right? So it's subjective because, it's based on how the examiner feels. So you really want to make it as interesting as humanly possible. P, have you planned interesting ideas and then executed them? So that's where the plan you could technically get marked for. S, have you structured your ideas using a range of sentences and paragraphs? So how is it actually structured? So have you used connectives? Have you used like these flowing sentences, varying sentence structure and length and blah, blah, blah. And here is basically a plan. I know that a lot of you may have already seen what a plan looks like, but I would recommend just like a mind map and literally just have one kind of bubble for each of the 5 or 6 paragraphs that you plan to do, and keep it as that. And lastly, a forest, which is the last part of this. So A stands for anecdotes. So personal stories are really, really powerful. And again, if you ever watch like TED Talks or something, in the vast majority of them, if they're trying to persuade people, in a lot of them, what they'll do is they'll talk about a personal story, which is what an anecdote is. So, again, with the school uniform, when I was in school, my school didn't even have school uniform. And because I was poor, I always had clothes that are like slightly torn, or they just like weren't fashionable, and I was bullied relentlessly for it, right? Because then you're feeling sympathetic to the person writing or speaking or whatever this piece of information. F, facts. So again, you can just make up statistics. Don't do this in real life, but for your exam, you're more than welcome to make up facts. O is opinion. So stating an opinion can be a relatively good technique. I would say it isn't the most powerful, but it is a technique, technically speaking. Then you also have rhetorical question or repetition. So repetition of the same idea. So again, the bullying thing with not having school uniform is, in my opinion, quite a good thing. It's not bullying isn't a good thing, but it's a good technique to use to repeat the same idea again and again to really hammer it home. Emotive language or exaggeration. So again, with the whole bullying thing, you could really exaggerate that and say, oh, their lives are miserable, they're bullied every single day, etc., etc. Short sentences. Again, they can kind of create a sense of like anxiety and a build-up and an increase in tension. And lastly, the rule of 3 or a triplet. So it could be 3 separate adjectives, or you could kind of repeat the same idea 3 times, something along those lines. But that's essentially what you want to think about when you're doing these persuasive techniques. Anyways, this video has gone on way too long, so I'm going to leave it here. Hopefully you found this useful. Again, in the description you have a link to part 1, and you'll also have the PDF link to all of these notes made nice and neatly for you. But I'll see you in the next one.